Juárez. ¿Qué es?
Un punto, ahí está.
Está exactamente atrás de nosotros.
Es correcto, ahora está a las 7 de nuestra posición con 10.5 millas. Lleva rumbo 283 y 334 de velocidad.
Comandante, ¿qué es eso?
A ver, busquen eso que viene atrás de nosotros.
On March 5th, 2004, a Mexican military plane flying over the area of Campeche realized it was being followed by a group of unidentified flying objects.
Lo raro es que trae una punta delante.
¿Qué es eso? Dios mío. No podemos saber qué distancia.
No tenía forma alguna de algún objeto que yo haya visto con anterioridad.
Ahí van más. Van más, siguen más atrás.
¿Abajo o arriba o arriba?
En medio, ahí van
a ir 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
O sea que lo tienen rodeado.
Pues no sé.
Qué barbaridad, ¿eh?
Ahí se van a ver bien. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 en la pantalla. 9, 10, 11 contando toda la cola.
The most interesting thing is that the objects appear in the infrared camera of the plane, but were not visible to the naked eye.
Nunca pudimos identificarlo visualmente, a simple vista nunca.
Had the camera not been operating at that time, the crew would have never known they had company.
Bueno, dije, no es normal, no es normal. Pero el icono aparecía ahí, estaba en el radar y ahí estaba.
The sudden changes in speed indicated that these flying objects used a far more advanced technology than
Las
ours.
ciudades podían estar, no sé, de 60 nudos, incrementarse a 120 o a 220 o a 300 nudos, cosa que pues jamás había visto, ¿no?
Mexican authorities chose to make the video available to the public, even though they had no valid explanation for the event. Quite different is the attitude of the American government, which has never officially recognized the existence of flying objects of unknown origin. This has caused a growing wave of former military and civilian pilots, air controllers, and even former astronauts who accuse the Pentagon of hiding the information on UFOs they have apparently been collecting for over 50 years.
Good evening. We begin with shocking allegations that UFOs have interfered with missiles at U.S. Air Force bases.
On July 2008, some former military officials have revealed that these unidentified flying objects have repeatedly managed to neutralize the nuclear defense system of the United States.
In 5 different states, they also claim a cover-up.
There are hundreds of declassified documents which indicate that UFOs have demonstrated a distinct and ongoing interest in our nuclear weapons sites. This is very widespread. What you're seeing here this evening is the tip of the iceberg.
And as I watched, the warhead...
In 1964, Lieutenant Robert Jacobs was a U.S. Army cameraman based in Vandenberg, California. While filming a missile test, he saw a flying object enter the frame, destroy the nuclear warhead, and then disappear in the same direction it had come from.
And suddenly, in the same direction this stuff was flying at about 8,000 miles an hour. The object came into the frame, shot a beam of light at the warhead, flew up to the top, shot another beam of light at the warhead, flew around the direction it was flying, shot another beam of light at the warhead, and flew out the same way it came in. And the warhead tumbles out of space.
The speed of the object, over 8,000 miles an hour, and its capability of changing direction in a matter of seconds brought the military to conclude it was not of terrestrial origin. After seeing the footage, Jacobs' superiors confiscated it and gave it to the CIA. Jacobs was forbidden from mentioning in public what had happened.
I said, "We got a UFO." And he said, "Lieutenant, you are never to speak of this again. As far as you're concerned, this didn't happen."
Jacobs' testimony is confirmed by Ross Didriksons, who at the time was an Air Force colonel.
They actually photographed the UFO following the missile as it climbed into space and shining a beam on it, which neutralized the missile. And this was recorded. It was all hushed up.
In 1967, Robert Salas was in charge of the nuclear launching pads in the military base of Maelstrom in Montana. It was the peak of the Cold War, and nuclear missiles were kept constantly on the ready in case of a nuclear attack. While Salas was in the underground control booth, he was informed that a strange flying object had suddenly appeared in the sky and was now stationed above the gates of the facility.
He wants to know what to do. I tell him to secure the facility. We hang up. I go to tell my commanders. So within seconds, my missiles start shutting down. I recall losing all 10 of them.
By shutting down, we mean what?
By shutting down, what I mean is they were not launchable. They were in no-go condition, disabled.
How long to restart them?
How long to restart? Well, I'm sure it took over a day. And
also, Salas's testimony is supported by the one of another colonel, Duane Arnson.
The crew going on duty and the crew coming off duty all saw the UFO just hovering in midair. It was a metallic circular object, and something turned those missiles off, and so they could not be put in a mode of launching.
It's important to bear in mind that these missiles are designed to be independent systems. So if you do something to affect one missile, it won't affect all the other missiles because they're totally separate.
The actual reason for so many missiles going down simultaneously was a big puzzle.
Salas, too, was told to never mention the event again.
He said, you need to sign these documents not to disclose any of this to anyone ever. And we signed, and basically that was it.
Is the United States government hiding knowledge of UFOs?
The war about the truth on UFOs between the American citizens and the military started back in 1947 with the well-known episode of Roswell, which is still at the center of a major controversy today. It is interesting to note that Roswell's Air Force Base housed the very planes that had dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki only 2 years before. During the week of the 4th of July, several people saw a strange flying object crash in a deserted area near the city. First to reach the crash site was Mac Brazel, a rancher who lived and worked nearby. Brazel collected some of the debris but was unable to figure out what it was, so he decided to bring it to the town's sheriff, George Wilcox. The sheriff was just as surprised by this material he had never seen and called the nearby military base. The intelligence officer in charge at the time was Major Jesse Marcel. Marcel went to the crash site and collected a few more pieces of debris. On his way back to the base, he stopped by his home to show them to his son, Jesse Jr.
He came back real late one night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, as I recall, very excited because he woke myself, my mother up saying they found parts of a UFO or a flying saucer at that time. And he wanted me to see it because it was such of an unusual type of finding.
Another person who saw some of these fragments is Frankie Rowe, the daughter of a local fireman who at the time was 11 years old.
When I would wad it up, it was like I had nothing in my hand. I couldn't feel it touching my skin. It was real weird. Drop it on the table and it was just like water, the way it would spread out.
On the very evening of the finding, the base commander, Butch Blanchard, announced to the press that the remains of a crashed flying disc had been recovered. The next day, the news was all over America.
The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection.
But in 24 hours, everything was to change dramatically. Jesse Marcel was summoned to the military base of Fort Worth, Texas, which was under the command of General Remy. Here, Remy called a press conference in which Jesse Marcel was forced to present some debris from a weather balloon instead of the material he had found in the desert near Roswell. The newspapers immediately published their retraction, and the news of the flying disc was officially considered dead. This is what Jesse Marcel Jr. had to say about this episode.
A photograph of the debris that was seen in General Ramey's office at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, Texas. This is my father holding up what is very obviously parts of radar target with balloon debris. Emphasize this is not what was seen on the floor of our kitchen that evening or that late early morning hours in 1947. This is totally different.
Further in life, Jesse Marcel would confess to his son that it had been in fact a cover-up from the military.
There obviously was a cover-up of this accident, because years later my dad said he was actually part of the cover-up because he went along with the weather balloon story.
Marcel told his son that he had been ordered to present the debris from the weather balloon and was told to never talk again about what he had seen in Roswell.
My dad explained to my mother that this was a non-event. Don't even discuss it with your friends. He didn't want me to talk about it, so we did not talk about it.
Jesse Marcel never went public on what he had seen in Roswell, but before he died, he gave this interview.
There were just fragments strewn all over the area, an area about 3/4 of a mile long and several hundred feet wide. One thing I was certain of, being familiar with all air activities, that it was not a weather balloon, nor an aircraft, nor a missile. It was something else of which we didn't know what it was.
Despite the official denial, people in Roswell were already convinced it had been a flying saucer. The local journalists were receiving requests for information from all over the world, and they kept telling everybody that the crashed object was not of terrestrial origin.
There was a tremendous amount of excitement because here I am, a little country editor in a small city in New Mexico, talking to Paris and Rome and London and Tokyo, and I can't remember all of them.
At that point, Roswell was hit by a wave of threats from the military authorities, directed against anyone who appeared to have some information about the incident. Frank Joyce had been among the first to break the news over the local radio station.
There was a young lady on the line saying, "Colonel so-and-so, this is the Pentagon calling." And the voice on the line says, "Did you put that story on the air about the flying saucers?" And I mean, his voice was, the type that really conveys menace and power. And I said, "Yes, I did." And he says, "You're going to get in a lot of trouble for this," or made some threatening comment. And I said, "Look, I'm a civilian. You can't tell me what to do in stories I put on the air." And he says, "I'll show you what I can do." And bang, hung up the phone.
Soon after, the owner of the radio station for which Joyce worked received a phone call from Washington.
I got a call from Washington saying, "Look, if you put out any stories on this thing, you're going to lose your license. And it's not going to be over a period of time. It's going to be the same day that we tell you that you're off the air."
Also, Frankie Rove's family received an unpleasant visit from a military who did not identify himself.
He had this club or stick or whatever it was, and he was beating it on his hand. And he would hit it. Every time he would say something, he'd hit his hand. And he said, "I want you to know you were never there." I didn't understand what he meant, because I said, "Yes, I was." And he said, "No, you weren't." I said, "Yes, I was." And he said, "Can't you get this through your head? You never saw anything. You were not there. You don't know anything." And he said, "This is a big desert out here. We can just take you out in the middle of this desert and no one will ever find your bodies." He said, "You'll be nothing but bones and nobody will ever know what happened to you."
Despite the efforts to cover everything up, the rumor of the flying saucer kept circulating all over the place. The military then changed the official version for the second time, and they said the object was a secret weapon composed by a weather balloon and a disc-shaped flying machine. But it was too late, and the flying saucer fever was already spreading across America. Hundreds of sightings were being reported from all across the country. Specialized publications flooded the market, and clubs of UFO believers were being born by the day. More and more people came forth, maintaining that they had seen flying saucers and claiming that soon the American government would have officially announced the existence of visitors from other planets.
And that before too long, the evidence will be incontrovertible, that the ships are here and that they are real.
What happened instead was exactly the opposite. In order to contain the popular excitement, the government created the so-called Project Sign, which was officially in charge of collecting and explaining the hundreds of sightings that were being reported from all over America. When the project was completed, however, there was a moment of true embarrassment, as even the military had to admit that they were not able to explain a substantial part of the sightings.
We have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports. There have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we now are attempting to resolve.
The heads of the project were immediately replaced, and the project itself was renamed Grudge. The new members of the team were clearly told to never talk about UFOs again. Headed by Major Quintanilla, Grudge appeared after every sighting and immediately offered an explanation of terrestrial nature for each case reported. After 3 professors from Ohio had photographed this formation of shining globes in the sky, Grudge explained that it was a flock of birds reflecting the light from the city underneath. After a multiple sighting, which involved also some local policemen, Grudge explained that it had been just vapors from a nearby swamp. As the preposterous explanations kept piling up, more and more people began suspecting that the military was hiding the truth to the population. But the military has always maintained that there was nothing to hide.
The Air Force has been accused from time to time of hiding information about UFO. What do you have to say to that, Colonel Taffy?
Well, these charges are absolutely untrue, and we've always honored accredited media when they want to investigate a given specific sighting.
There's nothing to hide.
There's nothing to hide at all.
In 1969, Grudge was terminated and published under the more appealing name of Project Blue Book. It listed over 12,000 sightings, the large majority of which was explained by natural phenomena, alleged hallucinations, or by flying crafts of terrestrial origin. But there remained over 700 cases which even the military could not explain. Despite this, the officials from Project Blue Book emphatically declared that there has been no evidence that sightings categorized as unidentified are extraterrestrial vehicles. With this statement, the U.S. military put an official end to their investigations on UFOs. But some internal documents, which were later declassified, told a completely different story. The phenomenon reported, read one of them, is something real and not visionary or fictitious. In an FBI internal memo, we can read, "The flying discs are not the result of Army or Navy experiments." In another Pentagon document is written, "Flying saucers exist. The matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the N-bomb." In the meantime, the number of UFO sightings was increasing, and the task of keeping a register was taken up by a private association of researchers and scientists called the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON.
The Mutual UFO Network is a non-profit organization dedicated to the scientific study of the UFO phenomenon.
Free from government bureaucracy, MUFON experts simply began archiving all the sightings reported without trying to explain them one way or the other. Since then, MUFON has grown to be a true international organization with offices in all the most important cities in the world. In America alone, MUFON has more than 1,000 private investigators who are sent on the field only after taking specific courses that prepare them to approach the interviews in a complete and consistent manner.
The job of the investigator is not to express an opinion, not to influence witnesses, but basically to keep his mouth shut, listen to what they have to tell him, and put that together in some kind of meaningful form. And you have to have some training to be able to approach the subject in the right way.
Once ready, the investigators are given a tape recorder, a photo camera, GPS instruments, and everything they need to thoroughly interview the witnesses of the sightings. All data collected is sent to the central office, where specialized operators analyze the different cases with scientific criteria and discard those that are clearly a fake or suspicious, as well as those that can be explained as natural phenomena of terrestrial origin. The remaining cases are carefully catalogued and archived. Unlike the military, MUFON makes its archives freely available to the public through the internet. This has produced a list of thousands of sightings, all considered legitimate, ranging from 1878 until today. A good percentage of the reports comes from the southwestern United States, especially Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. This is the area where most of the American atomic research takes place. In recent years, also Mexico has reported a wave of collective sightings. But there are now reports, valid and fully documented, from every corner of the world. Despite the severe criteria used by MUFON, it's possible that some of these cases are the result of errors or very well done tricks that went undetected. But there are at least as many reports in the last 50 years that defy any possible terrestrial explanation.
Take you to Los Angeles and the report of...
The first historic case is the so-called Battle of Los Angeles, which took place on the night of February 25th, 1942.
Anti-aircraft guns went into action against unidentified aircraft in the Los Angeles area.
Around 2 a.m., a huge flying object suddenly appeared over the skies of Los Angeles.
The object moved southward, presumably over Huntington Park.
It had been only 3 months since the United States had entered World War II. And immediately everyone believed the city was being attacked by some strange Japanese craft.
By 3:30 a.m., observers said the object...
But the mysterious object, which moved extremely slowly across the sky, revealed absolutely invulnerable to the anti-craft artillery.
Shells frequently could be seen bursting near the object, but none appeared to hit it.
More than 1,700 rounds of heavy artillery were fired against the flying object in less than 20 minutes. But the only damage registered was among the population due to the metallic debris falling from the sky.
The shooting brought warfare to the front door of this...
3 people died and a dozen more were wounded, while the flying object slowly disappeared into the night without having dropped a single bomb over the city.
Approximately 20 minutes after the firing died down, the ship returned and headed westward from Long Beach toward Santa Monica. Then the ship disappeared for the second time over the ocean.
Another famous case is the Lubbock Lights, which dates back to 1952. Hundreds of people reported multiple sightings of a strange formation of lights which repeatedly crossed the skies of the small Texas town. A group of professors managed to snap a few shots of the formation during the last passage. The images have been analyzed and declared authentic more than once. In 1958, a geological expedition from the Brazilian Navy observed a strange flying object near the island of Trinidade off the Brazilian coast. The team's photographer, Almiro Baraúna, caught the object before it disappeared behind the island, only to reappear a second later, traveling at full speed in the opposite direction. More than 50 out of the 300 sailors on board saw the same object moving erratically at high speed without ever producing the slightest sound. The Brazilian Navy had the negatives analyzed by their specialists, who concluded that there had been no manipulation of any kind. The object seen over Trinidad was real, and its fantastic performance remains impossible to explain even with the most modern technologies. One of the most famous cases ever took place in England in 1980 near the US military bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge, which at the time housed nuclear missiles. Around 2 a.m., the military on guard noticed a brilliant object descend in the forest of Randlesham, which is located between the two bases. The first group of military that inspected the forest found itself face to face with a strange, brilliant object silently floating among the trees a few inches from the ground.
When it was happening, everything seemed to go slower. We seemed to be in like a, I wouldn't say a time warp, but like everything appeared to be happening slower to us, and everything felt different. But when it disappeared, it was like everything was normal again.
The squad then called the deputy commander of the base, Colonel Charles Holt, who drove to the site filled with skepticism about what he had just been told.
And I was really going to debunk it, quite frankly. And as events unfolded, I became more and more concerned that there may be something to this.
Holt carried in his pocket a small tape recorder, which he normally used to take notes on location.
I did take an audio tape. In fact, I brought the original tape recorder with me, and I made a tape recording which is about 15 or 20 minutes long. It's rather famous now.
This is how we have a live recording of what Holt and his men were experiencing as they proceeded through the forest.
Blast, what looks like a blasted or scrubbed up area here.
In the spot where the floating object had originally been seen, 3 flattened areas of about 5 inches in diameter were found. The 3 spots formed a practically perfect equilateral triangle.
When I first saw it, I didn't perceive it as something sitting on the ground with a tripod, like a tripod type thing. Now all of a sudden there's physical proof showing that something sat down in that area.
At the center of the triangle, Holt's men registered radioactivity levels far higher than normal.
Up to 7/10. 7 units, it's calling on the 0.5 scale.
Nicholas Pope, at the time, worked for the British Department of Defense.
The British government defence intelligence staff subsequently assessed those radiation readings as significantly higher than background levels. So there was a real tangible, solid piece of evidence to back up this extraordinary testimony.
Also, the trees around the landing site showed freshly broken branches.
What we assume is a landing site, all having abrasion, facing in the same direction towards the center. Let's go.
We could see branches up to 1 inch, 2 inches in diameter, which had either been knocked completely off or had been bent downward.
But the biggest surprise for Holt and his men was yet to come.
Watch, straight ahead off my flashlight there, sir. There it is. Hey, I see it too. What is it? We don't know, sir. There is no doubt about it. There's some type of strange flashing red light ahead. Weird. It appears to be maybe moving a little bit this way. It's coming this way. It is definitely coming this way.
Jim Burroughs would say to Jim Penniston, "Do you see that? Do you see what's out there at the edge of the trees?" And as we got closer and closer, I saw it. It's like just looking up, and then I could see it moving left, right, left, right.
Oh, here he comes from the south. He's coming toward us now. Strange. And the flash is so bright to the star scope that it almost burns your eye. Now we're observing what appears to be a beam coming down to the ground. This is unreal.
It was kind of difficult going from a skeptic to suddenly a party involved in the whole thing. I really didn't know quite how to react. I guess I was a little concerned that are people really going to believe me when I tell the truth? And I thought I had no choice but to tell the truth.
Holt presented his superiors with a complete and detailed report of the incident, together with a copy of the tape recording. Despite this, the U.S. military has never acknowledged the presence of a UFO over their base. The soldiers who witnessed the incident were told to sign a document in which they stated that all they had seen was the distant glimmers from a lighthouse.
I was told to sign some paperwork stating that what I saw out there was just the beacon that was out there, and that there was nothing out of the ordinary. Yes, there was a cover-up.
The British Department of Defense immediately corroborated the American version of the facts, stating that there had been no threat to military security. Not everyone agreed.
That is one explanation, that it actually happened, as Colonel Holt reported. The other explanation is that it didn't. And in that case, one is bound to assume that Colonel Holt and all his men were hallucinating. That the colonel of an American Air Force base in Suffolk and his merry men are hallucinating when there are nuclear-armed aircraft on the base, must be of defense interest. If indeed what he says took place did take place, and why on earth should he make it up, then surely the entry of a vehicle from outer space, certainly not man-made, to a defense base in this country also cannot fail to be of defense interest.
In 1990, hundreds of people reported a strange object flying over the skies of the small town of Eupen in Belgium.
3 points lumineux très puissants, une petite lumière clignotante au centre, la forme triangulaire vole très lentement au-dessus des maisons.
Among the first to notice the strange presence were 2 officers from the local gendarmerie.
There was a huge triangular platform, and underneath it, strong headlights. And in the middle was this blinking, pulsating orange light. The whole thing was floating in the air.
The same object was later seen by a different group of officers.
We had no explanation for what it might be, but it was real, and it was above us.
The flying object was also seen by the NATO military radars covering the area.
We phoned to other civilian and military radar sites, and they had precisely the same echo at the same place.
The Air Force went on the chase, but the flying object started performing such maneuvers that it made it impossible for the jets to even approach it.
This is to confirm that we now have a lock-on.
The pilots confirmed that it was impossible for them to accelerate as quick as the target was.
The object dropped from 10,000 feet to 500 feet in a few seconds. That's not like, super technology. That's Star Trek.
We measured some exceptional accelerations which cannot be related to conventional aircraft. That is clear.
On the following day, more than 600 people reported having seen the same object over the city skies.
Immobile above the motorway.
In the middle was a flashing red light. It passed by approaching the roof.
The description was pretty much the same for everyone. The object was shaped like a triangle, with 3 powerful lights on each corner and 1 less powerful light in the middle.
Basically what we saw was this big triangle object with 3 bright white lightnings in the corners.
You could see 3 white lights which formed an equilateral triangle.
At a given moment, it tilted slightly. We could see again the shape of a triangle with bright headlights and one in the middle.
This original picture, electronically enhanced, shows the shape of the object to be perfectly consistent with the witness's description. After this episode, Belgium was inundated by a wave of sightings that lasted for several years. The most famous case of collective sighting is certainly the Phoenix Lights, which took place in 1997 in Phoenix, Arizona.
Weird happenings in the skies over Phoenix recently. And no one seems to be able to explain what it was. And now
thousands of Arizonans reported seeing a triangular shape.
Over 10,000 people saw a formation of powerful lights float silently over the skies before disappearing into the night.
This didn't look like anything I'd ever seen in my life.
Many investigators call it the largest sighting ever, lasting the longest amount of time seen by the largest number of people.
There are also many amateur videos that portray the same event.
Dude, they're all like little circles.
But it's like they're hovering.
Dude, we got a telescope. Where's the telescope at? I'm going to get the telescope.
So strange.
Oh my god, it's the weirdest thing. It's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. So weird, it's just hovering.
Some witnesses said that the lights belonged to a huge V-shaped object which floated for a long time over the valley without ever producing the slightest sound.
It was a giant V, all right? And the right side of the V went over us. The left side was like a couple blocks over. And as it's moving, it's blocking and unblocking the stars. There is actually a shape.
The object we saw, if we opened up a newspaper, you could not block out the object that we saw.
Because of the V-shape, someone suggested it could have been a B-52 bomber from the US Air Force. B-52s, however, are not equipped with that kind of lights. They are anything but silent, and above all, they cannot stay afloat in the sky.
My response was we could land all 40 of our B-2 bombers on the wing of that craft.
These are the proportions between a Boeing 727 and the object described by dozens of witnesses in Phoenix.
To me, the most shocking thing was the silence. I was like, how can this huge object in the air that was the size of, I compare it to 2 cruise ships almost, it was like a city in the air, not make any sound. It was just,
As popular pressure kept growing, the state governor, Fife Symington, promised an in-depth investigation on the sightings.
And now I'll ask Officer Stein and his colleagues.
He later called a press conference and announced to have found the solution to the enigma.
Don't get him too close to me, please.
But it was just a joke, meant to diffuse the overwhelming pressure.
Now, this just goes to show that you guys are entirely too serious.
Reporters laughed heartily, but the Phoenix people didn't take it very well.
I thought it was really disgusting. He was just dismissing everything that these people had seen and said, just like we're all Looney Tunes.
Nobody in state, local, federal, military, nobody wanted to talk about it. They didn't want to interview witnesses. They said it didn't happen. They said it didn't concern them. There was one council.
People in Phoenix were not giving up. They just wanted to know what the flying object was. The military then said it was an Air Force drill, in which they had dropped flares of the kind used in action to illuminate the terrain at night. Very few people bought it.
I mean, flares cannot keep a formation. They drift with the wind, they float haphazardly, they have huge smoke trails that are illuminated by the flares itself.
The biggest surprise of all came from the governor himself after he concluded his term in office. Once a normal citizen again, Symington confessed he had seen the large spaceship himself.
I think it was from another world. I've never seen anything like it, Larry. It was enormous. It's unlike anything I'd ever seen.
If you had been here 10 years ago and standing out here and looking up there at the lights and the view, you would have been astounded. You would have been amazed. And I suspect that unless the Defense Department proves us otherwise, that it was probably some form of an alien spacecraft.
This is Symington's explanation for having lied to his citizens 10 years before.
I think as a public figure you have to be very careful about what you say, because people can have pretty emotional reactions, and I said my goal wasn't to try to stir the pot.
But he himself seems to have been deeply touched by the event.
The lights were really brilliant, and it was just fascinating. I mean, it was enormous. It just felt otherworldly. You know, in your gut you could just tell it was otherworldly.
Also very credible are the sightings that take place in the presence of authorities, like in the case of Jalapa, Mexico in 2005. During a public ceremony in which the local governor was presenting the police with their new cars, a formation of flying objects appeared in the sky and was filmed directly by the reporters present on site. What really made Mexico famous in UFO history is the recurring appearance of true fleets of unidentified flying objects in the last few years.
Hay más de 20 platillos voladores, amigo, allá. Fíjese allá bien. Ahorita está pasando y todo el mundo está mirando.
Es un grupo de objetos de más de 3, se le llama flotilla, que viajan ya sea horizontal o verticalmente, con unas formas extrañas, ya sea boomerangs, esferas, discos.
Lately, also Europe has been registering the appearance of some flotillas of unidentified flying objects. This sighting took place in Islington, England in 2007. In January 2008, the citizens of Stephenville, Texas, witnessed a series of sightings that no one has yet been able to explain. Among the witnesses was also the county constable, Leroy Gayton.
I saw a red glow. It was a fiery red-looking color I'd never seen before. Didn't appear to be too far off the ground. It lit up and it faded and it reappeared right next to where I'd first seen it.
Steve Allen is a local businessman and a private airplane pilot.
And I saw two strobe lights coming towards us at a very high rate of speed. The closer it got, the slower they got.
I saw several white lights, bright lights. They appeared to be like strobe lights, and they were moving around the sky, not really grouped together. They were pretty far apart, just bouncing around.
It passed by. We could see the back side of it had quite a few unusual strobe lights flashing, and they reconfigured to a vertical strobe light scenario, and they turned into a flame, and then it just disappeared.
What was so astonishing is the speed that this thing took off. I mean, it took off so fast that it was like...
This amateur video seems to confirm the testimony by Leroy Gayton, who has repeatedly spoken about lights dancing in the sky.
But they weren't just doing this, they were like just moving. You know,
like a light show?
Yeah, similar to a light show.
After a while, the flying object seen by Steve Allen flew over in the opposite direction, chased by two military jets.
10 minutes later, the lights reappeared, and that's when we saw the two military jets, and we suppose in pursuit of chasing it, and they headed back east.
How fast was this vehicle going?
When we first saw it, Larry, I think it was probably running around 2,000 to 3,000 miles an hour. It's hard to judge. Coming at us very fast, but it was gradually slowing down. Like I said, by the time it got into Stephenville, it basically came to a complete stop.
The flying object came to a stop right above Ricky Sorrell's, a local farmer who at the time was out in the fields.
I was in the process of taking another step when I looked up, and there it was. And this thing was huge. It was so big that I couldn't see the edges through the canopy of the trees.
Where did it go, Ricky? Where did this thing go?
I was actually watching underneath, and when it took off so fast, if I would have blinked, I would have thought it vanished. But I had my eyes on it, and I know it took off flat at a 45-degree angle.
In the following days, the MUFON local offices were inundated with people who wanted to tell their story and wanted to hear the ones of others.
At midnight, when I go to bed, I just turn the camera on and catch that. What it is, I don't know.
There's a ball of fire coming through the clouds, and then the sky did this. Rear end would come over, and then the bottom end would come over, and just kept doing that, head over, and then it would go from left to right, and I believe there's other people out there.
We have NASA that explores. They may have a NASA of their sort that explores.
I think they're so amazed at us because we're such primitive compared to their standards. I think it's kind of like us watching an ant farm. I think that's the way they're doing us.
Obviously, the presence of these UFOs doesn't necessarily mean that they are all of extraterrestrial origin. Some people, in fact, believe that all unidentified objects ever observed are just secret military craft built right here on Earth. Already during World War II, Hitler's scientists were trying to build disc-shaped aircraft with which they hoped to turn the tables on their enemies in the last part of the war. After Germany's defeat, the same studies were taken up by the United States under the direct control of the CIA and the Pentagon. In the early 1950s, British inventor John Frost was working for the Canadian aerospace company called Avro. Frost proposed to the United States a new model of flying disc that would have the agility of a helicopter, would reach exceptional altitudes, and could fly at supersonic speeds.
John Frost had the promise of something that no one else could deliver at that point. A supersonic,
more than twice as fast as the speed of sound aircraft that could fly higher and faster than anything else out there and never needed a runway or any airfield to operate.
The Pentagon invested $10 million in the project, but the prototype exploded in the hangars before it could even be tested. Frost then reverted to a less ambitious project, which would have served as a platform for developing the flying disc proper. It was called Avrocar and was meant to be used as a sort of flying jeep to patrol large areas of territory. The prototype was presented to the Pentagon brass in 1959, but right from the start it showed strong limitations in maneuverability, due mostly to the lack of a tail and side stabilizers.
And the biggest challenge that the concept faced was the pitch instability. The aerodynamic center being so far forward of the center of gravity. It's not a good recipe for a happy flight.
Further efforts were made to improve the prototype, but ultimately the Pentagon scratched the project and the Avrocar never went into production. In the meantime, there had already been episodes like Trinidad or Lubbock, in which the flying objects had displayed exceptional operating capacities, superior even to modern-day technologies. In the 1960s, the military produced a new series of disc-shaped aircraft that were finally said to be able to fly. Hundreds of fans claim to have seen some of these mysterious objects fly near Area 51 in Nevada. In any case, we're still talking about airplanes with noisy turbine engines, which need long stretches of asphalt, like those present in Area 51, to take off and to land. It's a far cry from the mile-wide ships described by hundreds of witnesses, capable of remaining still and silent in midair before taking off at exceptional speeds, absolutely unthinkable with our technologies. Furthermore, it has been found that many of the images circulated in the 60s with an aura of secrecy were in fact the result of cheap photo retouching. In this case, the flying disc had replaced an experimental X-15 supersonic jet. Here instead, the two flying discs are covering the same X-15 and a regular bomber from the US Air Force. To stress how thin is the probability that all UFOs ever observed are of terrestrial origin, we have the testimonies of many military pilots, like the one of Captain Huertas from the Peruvian Air Force.
Oscar Santa María Huertas, y soy oficial piloto.
In 1980, says Huertas, a strange flying object was observed by more than 1,800 soldiers floating above the Peruvian base of Arecibo.
Mi comandante de unidad me dio la orden de despegar el mi jet Sukhoi 22 para dispararle al objeto esférico, porque estaba en espacio prohibido, sin permiso, y temíamos espionaje. Yo me acerqué al objeto y le disparé 64 obuses de 30 milímetros. Algunos obuses fueron contra el terreno y otros le pegaron de lleno al objeto, pero sin ningún efecto. Los obuses no rebotaron, probablemente fueron absorbidos. La pared de fuego en forma de cono que yo mandé normalmente hubiera destruido cualquier objeto en su camino. El objeto entonces empezó a subir y a alejarse de la base. Y cuando yo estaba a unos 11.000 metros, de repente se detuvo, forzándome a salir del lado porque ya me encontraba a solo 500 metros de él. Entonces hice un ascenso para atacarlo desde arriba, pero justo cuando ya lo había centrado en la mira y estaba listo a disparar, el objeto hizo un ascenso vertical evadiendo mi ataque. 2 veces más tuve al objeto en la mira, cuando éste se encontraba estacionario, y cada vez se alejó al último momento antes de mi disparo. Entonces decidí hacer un ascenso a toda velocidad para ponerme muy por encima del objeto, pero este empezó a subir también y casi en paralelo con mi avión. Cuando sobrepasé los 19.000 metros, el objeto se detuvo. Fue entonces que me acerqué a 100 metros del objeto. Tenía unos 10 metros de diámetro, estaba como esmaltado con una cúpula de color crema sobre una base metálica ancha y circular. No tenía motores, ni escapes, ni ventanas, ni alas o antenas. Carecía de todos los implementos típicos de un avión y sin ningún sistema visible de propulsión. Fue en ese momento que me di cuenta que esto no era un objeto para espiar, sino que era un ovni, algo completamente desconocido. Ya casi no tenía combustible, o sea que ya no podía ni atacar ni maniobrar mi avión, tampoco escaparme a alta velocidad, y sentí temor. Quizás este era mi fin. Tuve que planear parte de mi descenso por falta de combustible, haciendo zigzag y siempre viendo por mis espejos retrovisores, con la esperanza de que el objeto no me persiguiera. No pasó nada. Después de que aterricé, el objeto permaneció estacionario en el cielo por 2 horas más, a la vista de todos en la base. Todavía me da escalofrío cuando me acuerdo.
Another group of highly credible witnesses is represented by airline pilots, who often observe unidentified flying objects of exceptional dimensions while traveling along the regular commercial routes.
Pilots make especially good UFO witnesses. They know what's normal in the sky and what isn't. They've seen all different kinds of airplanes routinely. When a pilot reports a UFO, there's a better than average chance that that's what it was.
February 28, 1996, Flight Air Shuttle 5959, traveling from Detroit to Cleveland, observes a strange object of pulsating light that seems to be floating on the clouds right below.
Cleveland Air Shuttle 5959, we see traffic out there at a lower altitude. Do you have one there? Air Shuttle 5959, that's a negative, sir. I don't have anything out in front of you. Can you get an estimate on an altitude on it? Here, I'm going to estimate 2,000 feet below us, maybe, and sort of pulsating right about, 10 miles out.
The exchange is heard by a second plane, Mesaba 3179, who joins in the conversation.
Is that northwest of Detroit? Did you see that light? Yeah. Well, that's what I saw, a real bright white light, sometimes flickering underneath the cloud. Air Shuttle 5959, is that traffic that you saw earlier? Do you see him out there any longer? And that's permanent. It looks like a rotating light around it, like a frisbee type thing, and it's going around it. Well, Mesaba 3179, would you think it might be like a reflection, maybe perhaps off a beacon that for some reason is just one of those weird things, natural phenomena? Because I got nothing out there. This is definitely a distinct whitish, well, it's looking a little red and greenish light sort of pulsating, and it is consonant. It's not a beacon.
At this point, the pilot from the first plane decides to descend in altitude in order to observe the object with his own eyes.
Shuttle 5959. Just to keep you advised, we're descending to 4,000 feet right now, and as we descended through 10,000 feet, that object is above us right now. It is not on the ground. It's about 10,000 feet. I'll tell you what, that is weird. If you're sitting there pulsating.
November 18, 1995. Flight Lufthansa 405 from New York to Frankfurt crosses an unidentified cylindrical object flying in the opposite direction and leaving a thick trail of green smoke behind.
On our tail, about 10 minutes, we passed it just 1 minute ago, and it was looking strange.
The same object is seen by the pilot of British Airways 226, which follows the Lufthansa flight a few miles behind.
Opposite traffic, 2,000 feet above. It did have a very strong vapor trail, which looked more like smoke, and the light on the front was very, very bright. And Lufthansa 405, how far off your side did that traffic pass? It was pretty close, and like the speedboat said, it looked like 2,000 or 3,000 feet above on the left wing. Just one looked like a UFO.
A similar incident was registered by flight Swissair 127 in August of the same year.
Swissair 127, go ahead. Yes, sir. I don't know what it was, but it jumped over to like a couple of hundred feet above us. I don't know if it was a rocket or whatever, but incredibly fast, opposite direction. It was too fast to be an airplane.
May 26, 1995. The crew from Flight America West 564, traveling from Florida to Nevada, observes a strange object with a series of flashing lights floating still in the skies of Texas.
There's nothing on the radars on the other spinners at all on that particular area, that object that's up in the air? It's up in the air? Affirmative. What's the altitude about? I don't know, probably right around 30,000 or so, and it's a drill that starts them going counterclockwise, and the length is unbelievable.
Not seeing anything on their radars, FAA controllers contact NORAD, the American Air Defense System, which confirms to have no operations in progress in the area at that time.
I've got something unusual, and I was wondering if you all happen to know of anything going on out here. I had a couple of aircraft reported something 300 to 400 foot long, cylindrical in shape with a strobe.
Oh.
At 30,000 feet.
We don't have anything going on over that I know of.
This guy definitely saw it run all the way down the side of the airplane. It's right out of the X-Files. I mean, it's a definite UFO or something like that.
After a few minutes, NORAD calls back FAA and confirms the sighting on their radars.
Hey, we're tracking a search-only track kind of where that might have happened. We've been tracking it for about 3-4 minutes now.
In the meantime, the huge cigar-shaped object, over 300 feet long, has disappeared into thin air. What impresses airline pilots the most is usually the speed of these UFOs, which seems unconceivable for our technological means.
They had just underneath our radar, picked up a blip. He's moving about a mile a second. Just pull out straight ahead of us, just disappear. Man, he was there and then he was gone.
Even though this kind of incidence is rather common, neither the FAA nor the military have ever acknowledged the existence of these unidentified flying objects. In fact, pilots are heavily discouraged to talk about these sightings altogether.
The pilots that had seen things had talked about it. Some of them were let go. Some of them released from their flying and treated as nutcases and things like that.
If you report a UFO sighting to the FAA, you might as well turn in your license the next day. The FAA, the military, even civilian authorities don't want to know about UFOs.
What can the reasons be, one wonders, for such a strict, systematic, and obsessive form of secrecy? In 1952, the city of Washington was literally flooded from UFO sightings, to the point that jet pilots were ordered to shoot down any aircraft that refused to land on command.
Washington, D.C., the capital of our country.
But UFOs were always able to elude the chasing jets with great ease.
I was 18 years old. UFOs buzzed the Capitol and buzzed the White House on July 19th, 1952. I recorded it in my diary. No one knew what it was. The switchboards lit up. Everybody was confused. A few days later, Truman, who was president then, had General Samford go on television. I have the kinescope, actually, and say, look, they're not ours and they're not Russian. We don't know what they are.
We can say that the recent sightings are in no way connected with any secret development by any agency of the United States.
The situation had sounded the alarm at the highest levels, and President Truman created a commission called the Robertson Panel, which immediately advised to keep all the new information on UFOs hidden from the population.
The Robertson Panel concluded that it was in the best interest of the United States government to suppress media coverage of UFO sightings.
In particular, the Robertson Panel suggested that mainstream media should be used to deny any future sighting, while it instructed the media people to cover with ridicule anyone who tried to maintain the existence of extraterrestrial vehicles. For the first time, an official document bore the term debunking, which indicates the activity of those who endeavor to discredit any rumors of conspiracies by the government. The Robertson Panel was followed by the so-called Brookings Report, in which the rationale for keeping the public unaware of the truth on UFOs was somehow explained. The report recalled the infamous radio broadcast by Orson Welles, aired a few years before, in which an imaginary invasion from Mars had been described. Many people had taken the broadcast for real, causing a wave of panic and suicides all across the country. Anthropological files, read the report, contain many examples of societies sure of their place in the universe, which have disintegrated when they had to associate with previously unfamiliar societies espousing different ideas and different life ways. As remarked by this CNN reporter, however, this motivation appears insufficient to justify the extreme level of secrecy that surrounds the UFO phenomenon.
this really is a government that doesn't mind scaring us. We still have orange alerts and red alerts, and they scare us all the time. It keeps people in work.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering why you think, and you just state that that's the reason and that's it. Was that really the motivation?
At the end of World War II, a race to atomic armaments had begun between America and the Soviet Union. And from that moment on, also the Russians began receiving visits from strange unidentified objects. In the beginning, the Americans thought that the unidentified objects in their skies were Russian, while the Russians feared the opposite. But soon both nations realized that they were dealing with far too advanced technologies to be originating from the other superpower.
Спонтанно предполагали, что это что-то другое. Американцы думали на русских, русские думали на японцев, но где-то в недрах системы, среди умных людей, что здесь что-то другое, с чем нужно будет нам, и американцам, кстати, и русским, серьезно разбираться.
At that time, astronaut Gordon Cooper was a test pilot for the new U-2 recognition planes and was therefore familiar with the most advanced technologies available to the Army.
So I knew that we didn't have any vehicles of that kind, and I was 99.9% sure that the Russians didn't have any of that type either.
Вот тогда начали думать, что здесь действительно что-то есть.
A secret competition between the Soviets and the Americans had begun, both nations intending to acquire new technologies by shooting down any unknown flying object that would appear in the skies. About 1 year after Roswell, a similar incident took place over the Russian base of Kapustin Yar.
A Russian pilot encountered a UFO in 1948 and tried to attack it with extremely unfortunate results for both. The pilot was blinded by rays of light emanating from the UFO.
Both aircraft crashed to the ground a few miles away from the base. It is interesting to note that Kapustin Yar was the exact equivalent of Roswell, in that most studies on nuclear war technology were being conducted there. Sergei Khrushchev is the son of former Prime Minister Nikita Khrushchev, who at the time was the Soviet Union's political leader.
I know everything because I spent months and years in the Kapustin Yar, working there testing our cruise missiles that we designed for the Soviet submarine to sink American aircraft carriers.
It seems that the UFO shot down over Kapustin Yar was the first aircraft of unknown origin captured by the Russians, just as the one captured in Roswell was the first one for the Americans. But it seems that in the Soviet Union, the air battles were far more frequent and brutal than those over the American skies.
There were 40 instances where Russian warplanes were sent after UFOs. This is not temperature inversion, this is not a weather balloon, this is not swamp gas, these are craft floating around in the airspace of Russia, and they sent warplanes to go chase them.
Former pilot and cosmonaut Marina Popovich, a Russian national hero, confirms to have witnessed a battle in the sky between a UFO and a Russian MiG.
Alexander Kopegin was the commander of a squadron and a pilot instructor in one of the flight schools. One day he was flying with a cadet and they were attacked by a UFO. They went into a spiral dive.
The same Popovich, during a different mission, saw a group of UFOs flying over the skies of Russia.
I saw 3 fireballs, 3 amazing lights in the form of a triangle, and I observed them as they flew away.
It is thus understandable that also the Soviets, like the Americans, always tried to keep the maximum secrecy over the UFO phenomenon.
Everything was top secret. It was nothing there not secret.
CIA agents from Russia often sent dispatches confirming the sightings on part of the Soviets. They noted that also in Russia, the sightings were often taking place near their nuclear bases. In the 1970s, the Russians experienced an incident similar to the one reported by Robert Salas in the Air Force Base of Maelstrom, Montana. After a strange, brilliant object was seen floating over a missile site in Ukraine, one of the missiles with an atomic warhead suddenly began the launch sequence without anybody having started it. Something or somebody had entered the secret codes that started the irreversible launch sequence. For the longest 15 seconds, the Russians tried to stop the procedure, which would have launched a missile towards a fixed target in the United States, but were unable to do so. A few moments before liftoff, the flying object left the skies over the base, and everything went back to normal.
They were ready for launch. The UFO, poof, goes away. Poof, the command control module goes back to normal.
In a different instance, it appears that an entire group of Russian ballistic missiles was destroyed on the launch pads from the intervention of some UFOs.
I have heard a story, for what it's worth, and I don't usually talk about myths, but I've heard that 4 Soviet big launch vehicles were exploded on the pads by aliens because they kept trying to shoot down the flying saucers.
According to the Russian National Archive, which released these images, this is the retaliation from the UFOs after the Soviets had shut down 2 of their craft over a site housing ballistic missiles. But also in Russia, at some point, the sightings became too frequent to just pretend that the problem didn't exist.
Информации достиг, какого-то уровня, будем говорить, кризисного, что ли. Когда уже замечать эту информацию.
Thus, also the KGB decided to prepare an official report over the sightings, which was in some ways very similar to Project Blue Book. It was called the Blue File and was eventually made public in 1990. The Blue File described over 15,000 cases of sightings, air chases, flying accidents, and shootdowns involving both UFOs and Russian jets.
I believe this is not everything the KGB has had in their hands, and I'm not the only one.
In the meantime, the United States and the Soviet Union had signed the Nuclear Agreement of 1971, which happened to include some specific procedures to avoid confusing the presence of possible UFOs with regular enemy planes over each nation's domestic skies. In the agreements it was written, the parties undertake to notify each other immediately in the event of detection by missile warning systems of unidentified objects if such occurrences could create a risk of outbreak of nuclear war between the 2 countries. Who could these unidentified objects belong to, if not one of the 2 very nations signing the agreement? Furthermore, a question arises. If Russians and Americans had already developed technologies capable of disabling the enemy's nuclear missiles, as it happened in Maelstrom, Montana for the Americans, or in the Ukrainian base for the Russians, why has the Cold War continued for 20 more years? And why are nuclear missiles still being built today? Also, Europe has taken the UFO problem quite seriously. After the Bentwaters case, and especially after the wave of sightings in Belgium, French President Chirac ordered a commission composed of top-level experts to study the UFO phenomenon in depth. The working group was called COMETA and included scientists like André Lebeau, director of CNES, the French equivalent of NASA, General Norlin, former commander of the French Air Force, Jean-Claude Rive, famous scientist and former director of the Lyon Observatory. The title of the report was UFOs and Defense. What shall we prepare for? The group analyzed over 500 sightings from all over the world, giving priority to those reported by people of maximum credibility like civilian or military pilots. The COMETA group integrated their analysis with reports and investigations from the alleged UFO landing sites. The COMETA report concluded that these craft demonstrate the reality of UFOs with remarkable silent flight performances, apparently operated by intelligent beings. But in the absence of explanations for the phenomena cited, the hypothesis of an extraterrestrial origin can no longer be ignored. These extraterrestrials possess high intellect and are technologically advanced over us to have been able to achieve what we do not yet know how to do. All this, concluded the report, implicates some major issues relating to global security and calls for all nations to tackle the UFO issue in a joint manner. But in the United States, the COMETA report found no major publisher willing to distribute it. Besides a small article on the Boston Globe, no major newspaper in America even mentioned the report, and each time a journalist tried to bring up the issue with their own editors, they would be met with a stern refusal and often with derision. Leslie Keene is one of them.
People laughed, hung up the phone. The subject matter is ridiculed in the media. And so even though I was dealing with facts in this article and high-level journalism, they weren't interested because of the subject matter.
It seems, therefore, that we are still paying the consequences for the disinformation and derision campaign set in motion by the Robertson panel and then implemented for decades by the U.S. government with rigorous determination.
In the military, they do ridicule you, because I was ridiculed a few times. I was told I would never make Master Sergeant if I brought this crap up again.
There seems to be some reason to discredit very viable and very reputable witnesses when they say something is unidentified.
Now, one of the things that I've found is that the way it's been kept secret to a big extent is the fact of through ridicule. If it always had been just top secret, I think most of the world would know about it. At times I used to carry nuclear weapons. In other words, I was mentally fit to carry nuclear weapons, but I'm not mentally fit if I see a UFO.
And when derision appeared insufficient, true threats would come into play.
It had been discussed with me on numerous occasions. Talked about what could happen to me militarily and what could happen to me even if I discussed this as a civilian.
Anything to discredit you, and you'd never get a promotion, and I'd spend the next 3.5 years up at the North Pole living in a tent checking the weather balloons.
If their military personnel were to talk about this, they could be court-martialed, or at least threatened to be court-martialed to get them to back down and to scare them.
He was talking about being erased. And I said, man, what do you mean erased? He said, yes. He said, you will be erased. He said, they'll go after not only you, he said, they'll go after your family. Now, those were his words.
And they're yelling at me, and they're hollering and cursing, and you didn't see anything, you know, and we'll do you and your whole goddamn family. And they're you know, it was basically that for about 8 or 9 hours. These guys, they're just off on their own. There's no oversight, no control, and they just do whatever they want.
Measures have been taken by agencies to terminate people who appear to be inconvenient or troublesome through knowing too much.
I would go interview people that claimed they had seen something and try to convince them they hadn't seen something, or they were, you know, hallucinating or something. Well, if that didn't work, another team would come in and give all the threats and threaten them, their family, and so on and so forth. And they would be in charge of discrediting them and make them look foolish or so on and so forth. Now, if that didn't work, then there was another team that put an end to that problem, one way or the other.
It was a real eye-opener, how deep the secrecy goes, how deep the cover-up is.
Thanks to this strategy based on derision and intimidation, the Pentagon walls still protect the most important information on UFOs ever collected by the US in the last 60 years. And since the problem doesn't officially exist, it's not even possible to identify the agency one would need to address to get more information.
See, this is what you'll be up against. Who are you going to see? So you see how the government operates? Even with the experience I had being on the top of the government all the years, I couldn't tell you who to go see.
Even presidents like Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, who wanted to know more about the UFOs, were met by a wall of silence and refusal.
And President Carter, after his inauguration the previous day, called the Director of Central Intelligence in and informed him that the President wanted to have access to the classified documents relating to unidentified flying objects and the potential existence of extraterrestrial intelligence. At that time, the Director of Central Intelligence, George Bush Sr., informed the President that Mr. Bush was not going to release this information to the President.
When President Clinton requested all the information available on UFOs, he received this letter from NASA. No government agency is currently responsible for investigating UFOs because there is no actual evidence that alien life exists on other planets or that UFOs are related to aliens. Talking about Roswell, Bill Clinton once stated that I did attempt to find out if there were any secret government documents that revealed things. If there were, they were concealed from me too. And if there were, well, I wouldn't be the first American president that underlings have lied to or that career bureaucrats have waited out. It thus appears to exist an invisible military elite which somehow holds the most important information gathered in the last 60 years about UFOs, which escapes any kind of government control.
A shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself.
It is a clandestine group, a quasi-government group, a quasi-private group. It is without any type, as far as I can tell, of high-level government oversight. And that is a great concern.
And the truth is, they have hidden things like UFO and extraterrestrial information from us for years.
When working at the radar system of the Defense Intelligence Agency, John Maynard realized that something was wrong and questioned his superior.
I noticed the satellite's positionings. I said, now this is supposed to be a system that tracks radar anomalies on Earth, right? You know, the whole thing, the movement. Yep, that's what it does. And I said, so why are half of them pointed towards the outer space? Towards the moon, towards areas that are just blank space? Well, I don't know, was the reply. He says, never thought about it. I says, well, at least half of those satellites you got up there aren't looking at Earth. I said, what are they looking for? He says, well, you got to have need to know about that. I said, I see. In other words, who's coming? He says, we don't know. Dropped, end of subject.
It requires to be further protected to ensure that there is only a limited access to that information to a small number of people. So small you can put them on a list of paper or on a piece of paper and list them by name.
Depending on the level of the compartmentalization and the secrecy level, you have to go through a fairly significant background check. But then you have to sign a statement that you will not divulge the existence of the project or even answer a question that could divulge the existence of the project. It's just that you sign a contract with the U.S. government and the funding would show up at the right place at the right time. There's a large number of covert projects that go on in the United States that none of us are ever aware of.
There's only probably about 25 people in the world that know things that are known at that level.
Though apparently fantastic, it begins to form the possibility that atomic weapons are being developed in the hope of countering one day an attack from an extraterrestrial civilization, and one wonders if this could be the true reason behind the so-called Star Wars project.
Big enigma. When Star Wars was brought out as an idea, which was before Reagan actually, they wanted a weapon system they could put in space that would stop a ballistic missile. That was the concept. Now, if that ballistic missile happened to be coming from another direction other than earthbound, could it do the same thing?
This possible scenario appears absolutely catastrophic, and the chance that somebody believes that we could fight extraterrestrial civilizations with our nuclear weapons places the entire humanity at utmost risk.
If beings can travel in time-space, then anything we would put in orbit as a weapon would be like going against Genghis Khan with a firecracker.
We are moving in an avenue where we are going to militarize space. As a direct result, we will become a threat to them.
Even more terrifying would be if the information on UFOs were kept secret to continuously feed an arms industry that sees the stellar shield as a source of infinite profits. one is reminded of the words that Ronald Reagan pronounced after having met with Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Gorbachev.
I couldn't help but say to him, just think how easy his task and mine might be in these meetings that we held if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species from another planet outside in the universe.
It must be noted that Reagan repeated the same speech 4 different times, one of which in front of the United Nations.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
Humanity is now left with one major question. If extraterrestrials do not exist, how many billions of dollars are being spent to feed the so-called military-industrial complex instead of being diverted into peaceful technologies and innovations which are at this point dramatically needed on our planet? If instead extraterrestrials exist and are capable of penetrating our atmosphere at will, what are the risks of a nuclear confrontation with these unknown entities? And who should be charged with making decisions that could affect the future of the entire humanity?
We want the United States government to stop perpetuating the myth that all UFOs can be explained away in down-to-earth and conventional terms. When it comes to events of this nature, dealing with the great unknown, we deserve, I believe, more openness and a serious pursuit of the facts by our government.
There is a serious possibility that we are being visited and have been visited for many years by people from outer space, from other civilizations. That it behoves us, in case some of these people in the future or now should turn hostile, to find out who they are, where they come from, and what they want.
And I think it's our job to try to find out if there is really something in the air, where it comes from, what the origin is, and what the intentions are.
Jóvenes, no estamos solos. No estamos solos.